Hey, everybody. How's everyone doing today? I'm the last talk, so I guess I'm a cherry on the top of everything you learned today. Hope you had a good day. I am an epileptologist. I used to see kids. Now I just do adults here in Oregon. I'm not a geneticist, but I'm really interested in it. I think it has a lot to teach us about probably it's a big direction on how we're going to be treating epilepsy in the future. And as a clinician, we get asked all the time, what are the chances my kid's going to have epilepsy? What are the chances their brother's going to have epilepsy or their sister? So this is a really common clinical question, and I hope to shed some light on that today. So again, overall theme is epilepsy inherited? And so we're going to talk about genetics, which is the study of heredity. And just as an overview of my talk, I'm going to talk about our evolution of our understanding of epilepsy genetics. And excuse my pun on that one. We're going to be talking about just some very basic concepts of genetics. I'm not going to go into boring deep detail, hopefully, just enough to give you some background to understand. Then I'm going to talk about, like an example, theoretically, what are someone's chances that their kid is going to have a seizure disorder? Genetic testing, that comes up too, and you probably heard about that. Is it worth it? What are the benefits? What are the risks? And we're going to talk about the future. How can genes and understanding genes affect our understanding of epilepsy therapy? So, first question is, why do we think epilepsy has a genetic basis? And that goes way back, to the dawn of when people started to think about epilepsy. Hippocrates, this ancient Greek dude, he was really the first one to scientifically think about epilepsy. He said that it was not a disease caused by evil forces or spirits, but it was a disease of the brain, just like any medical condition. And he actually recognized that heredity could play a role in the causes of epilepsy. Unfortunately, that was a stigma for people with epilepsy for many, many years. In the United States, believe it or not, they had laws prohibiting marriage into the late 20th century. And there were sterilization laws. So a lot of discrimination based on that. He didn't have any recommendations for treatment, but at least he was the first to get us thinking about this. Then researchers, they didn't really know how to. They suspected that genes were related, but they suspected that genes were related, but they didn't really know how to go about studying them. And that was not until William Lennox in 1945. He was really the father of epilepsy genetics. And what he did was twin studies. So the cool thing about twin studies is you can see how much genetic factors play a role. So remember, there's two types of twins. There's identical twins. They have identical genetic information. And then there's fraternal twins, which are a little bit different. So if identical twins are more likely to share a genetic condition like epilepsy than fraternal twins, then it's more likely that it has a genetic basis. And that's what he showed. And actually, he had some really interesting case reports. These are two twins who have epilepsy, Constance and Catherine. They were identical twins. They both had the same type of seizure disorder. They had childhood absence epilepsy. And they both had identical age of onset at age 6. And even their brain waves, their EEG tests, look really similar. So really, really interesting. and very hopeful for guiding us for understanding epilepsy. So more recent genetic researchers have followed up on his work, and they did confirm that identical twins are more likely to share having epilepsy than fraternal twins. Does that mean that epilepsy is 100% inherited? And no, definitely not. So they've done studies since then looking at the risk in non-twin populations. And many studies have been done. And it looks like there's, passing down through the generation, there's about a 4% risk. So, well, 4%, well, what does that mean? Remember, epilepsy is a really common condition. It affects at least 1% of the population. Other studies maybe even higher. So 4% versus 1%. So there is a little bit of a genetic influence, but it's actually not that much. And if you think about it, 4%, that means that the majority of people who have epilepsy, who have children, 95% plus, they're going to have kids without epilepsy. So it plays a role sometimes, but and oftentimes it's not very profound. So let's just go a little deeper and talk about some basics of genetics. So the study of genetics really started with Gregor Mendel in the 1860s. Now he was a monk. You probably have heard of him. He was actually he was really interested in going to science, and then I think he failed out basically. He was like, well, he didn't really do well, so they kicked him out of school. He became a monk, but he went on, and he was really interested and very methodical, and he was the first to do these very important experiments with pea plants, and he showed that traits could be passed down along the generations in a predictable way. And he thought there was probably some kind of unit, like a gene, which contained that information. But then, he just left that aside, and no one was really interested in it. And I think he got famous for being a very important administrator in the church. And his work was ignored. But eventually, they read about it. They learned about his theories about heredity. And then Watson and Crick discovered the DNA, which is the basis of the gene, and everything changed. So, just very, very basic overview. You can think about the genome is like the library. That's which contains all our genetic material. And you can think of the genome as having books, which are the chromosomes. And then in the books, there are particular sentences or words which you call genes. These genes are important for making proteins, and proteins are the building blocks of cells. Our body is made out of cells. So if you have a mutation in the gene, which is like the blueprint for the protein, you may have a problem. So what we know today is epilepsy frequently has a genetic basis, and I think this was well said in the previous talk. It's sprinkled through many, many conditions, right? That's true. So anything that injures the brain or affects the brain as a genetic condition can have epilepsy as a feature. But it's only very, very rarely that you have genetic diseases where you just purely have a seizure disorder without having motor disability or intellectual disability. And how do genetic factors cause epilepsy? Remember we talked about that library and the books. So you can have a problem in the books, which we call chromosomal abnormalities. And this is just an overview, and then I'm going to go into each one individually. You can have problems with genes involved in brain formation, brain metabolism, and brain communication. So again, the chromosomes are the books in the library. So each one of these books contains many, many genes, and it's all yin and yang. So if you have too many books with telling the brain to get excited, then and not enough to have the brain be inhibited or calm down, you may end up with a seizure disorder. So chromosomal abnormalities can lead to intellectual disabilities and conditions with seizures. And it could be based on number or based on the shapes of the chromosome. They could be misformed. In fact, there's something called Ring 20 syndrome, which is an important form of genetic epilepsy. And then another major category, and this has really been hot in epilepsy research lately, is brain formation. So, I always like to tell my patients, there are more brain cells, neurons, in the brain than there are stars in the universe. It's pretty incredible. So think about that. All those brain cells, they have to go to the right place. I mean, that's a major miracle that they do. But how did they get there? They're guided by genes, and genes are like the GPS of the brain, making sure that the brain cells get to the correct place. And if they don't, then you can, in the normal brain, there are normal folds and ridges, which are called the sulci and the gyri. And if they're not in the right place, there's all different sorts of development abnormalities you can see, and one thing you can see is a smooth brain, which is called lissencephaly. Another major problem is with brain communication. So how do brain cells communicate? They communicate with ion channels. Ion channels are important for directing the chemical interchanges between the cells. Those are like neurotransmitters and different molecules like salts. So if you have ion channels that are not formed right because the genes are mutated, you can have leaky brain cells, and that can lead to overexcitement, and that can lead to seizures. And that's how anti-seizure medications work. They work at these ion channels. But if they're faulty, then they may not work. Another major category of how genes cause epilepsy is with brain metabolism. So, the brain needs food, and the food creates waste, and genes are important for getting rid of those wastes. They're like the garbage men of the cell. So if you don't have those enzymes to get rid of the waste, then you can have buildup of toxins and other nasty things that can lead to the death of the brain cells, and that can lead to big problems, including seizures. So, well, how is epilepsy inherited? Why is it that it's not so easy to predict? And that's because there's really two major types of epilepsy genes. I came up with this on my own. I say that there's genes with simple inheritance, which are called strong genes, and then there's genes with complex inheritance, which are called weak genes. So I like to think of the strong genes as like sharks, and the complex genes more like a school of piranhas. They're going to cause you problems, but in different ways. So the strong genes, those are the ones that are really biologically important. See, if you get one of those, it's like a strong poison sometimes. It's really bad, and they can have bad effects. There's not that many of these strong genes, because if you're born with it, you may die as a fetus, or you may die soon after birth. So strong genes are rare. However, when they do occur in a family, and they can occur very, very commonly in the family tree. So again, it goes back to Mendel. Mendel showed us pea plants. Traits are inherited, just like, red hair can run in a family. So can diseases. And, a classic example of that is cystic fibrosis, where if mom and dad, for example, have the gene, then 25% of their offspring are going to have it. So another example is Huntington's disease, where 50% of the family have it. So these are very, very rare, but if you draw a pedigree from a family, they're really easy to predict. So for epilepsy, there are really few of these strong genes out there. The sharks, and I call them sharks. If you run into them, it's going to, just one of them, it's going to be a big problem. And, at this point, more than 10 have been identified. I mean, I think in my career, a handful of times I've seen patients with these conditions, and they account for very, very few cases of epilepsy. Dravet syndrome, I think, who's heard of Dravet syndrome here? Almost everybody. Yeah, that's one of the major epilepsy genes. Weak genes. Weak genes may not be powerful enough to cause epilepsy on their own, but they can be an influencing factor along with genes or other environmental stimuli. So, when we talk about diseases, usually we don't say, 25% chance of, our kids getting it. Then we say, this condition runs in the family. A lot of times you hear people say, that skips a generation. That's what we, and that's very true for epilepsy, schizophrenia, high blood pressure. It's like most diseases. Why do we see that kind of pattern? It's because no single gene may be responsible for the disease in that family. It may take many of these bad, weak genes to cause the disease in the family. So instead of being like a shark, it's like a school of piranha. It takes, if you ran into one piranha, you'd probably be okay. But if you ran into a school of them, then you're in trouble. And that may be true for ion channels. The ion channels, it may take a lot of bad genes to make them leaky, not just one. And sometimes it may be that you need both the genes and an environmental factor. So some families, people are okay and don't get lung cancer, but if they smoke with bad genes, then they get lung cancer. All right, so let's go through a case and talk about what's someone's kid's risk of developing epilepsy. So can we predict if a child will have epilepsy if the mom or a parent has, when the parent has epilepsy? And the truthful answer is most times we can only give very, very rough odds. So like a case study, 33-year-old woman, she has epilepsy, she's planning to get pregnant, and we hear this all the time. What's my chance my kid will have seizures? First thing is we want to take a look at that patient and really see if they have a type of epilepsy which is due to genetic causes or due to some other factor. So, you probably went through this on other talks, but epilepsy is really caused by anything that irritates the brain or causes a structural problem. So brain infection, stroke, degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, those kind of conditions where there's some kind of acquired injury, like car accident causing a brain injury and a seizure disorder, those are not going to be passed on from generation to generation. So then after we determine if there's a non-genetic cause, then we take a look and we decide, well, what type of seizure disorder does the patient have? Is it a generalized, coming from all over the brain, or is it a focal? And this is, again, somewhat of a simplification, but I just wanted to make it very clear. And then there, our studies, So then we want to determine her seizure types and what type of epilepsy she has. And in this patient, she has these bilateral muscle jerks, so twitching, that she noticed when riding on the school bus at age 15. Does anyone know what that's called? Myoclonus. So that's a type of seizure. It's a generalized type of seizure. She had her first generalized convulsion at age 16, which were preceded by these myoclonic jerks. She's really successful, normal exam. On her EEG test, she did have going along with the generalized epilepsy, has generalized spike wave on her EEG. And her epilepsy is really well controlled on lamotrigine. So she has a type of epilepsy, very common. It's called juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. It's a generalized epilepsy. They have the myoclonic seizure types with the jerking and the generalized tonic-clonic seizures. They can also have absence seizures too. I'm not going to go too much into that today. So then we want to know about the other family members with epilepsy. And this is, a lot of times it's really, really important to get a good family history. And, the patient might know. Sometimes you need to speak to grandma or some other elder in the family to get a really good family history. And then we draw what we call a pedigree. We take a history of each member of the family, and we see who has epilepsy, who doesn't, and we look at it and see if there's any patterns. Remember, we look for the Mendelian patterns, simple patterns of inheritance. The circles are the females, the squares are the males, and top to bottom is going along through the generations. Our patient is here in the red, and really there's no simple pattern. There is someone else, in the family who has epilepsy, but they're pretty remote. So no strong genes look apparent. It looks more like a complex or inheritance. Some other ways we can know how much there is going to be of genetic risk is by looking at risk factors in the parent. So it's interesting, but moms are a little bit more likely to pass on epilepsy than fathers. And the age of onset of the patient's epilepsy is really important too. After age 20, if someone develops epilepsy after age 20, then the odds are really low that their family is going to see children with epilepsy. And the reason for that is genes usually declare themselves before age 20, not after. I mean, there's always exceptions to that rule. More family members affected, the higher the risk. And also those generalized spike waves on EEG. I'm going to skip that. So what do we tell this patient? We tell her that she has generalized epilepsy. She's got that juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. We don't think there's any strong genes that we could clearly see in her family. We could be wrong, but it doesn't look obvious. And this patient, we'll talk about genetic testing too, but we don't have any genes for those weak genes, so really couldn't do genetic testing for her in the most likely way. The bottom line for that patient is we can never tell anybody that they're not going to have a kid with epilepsy, and we can never tell anyone that they're never going to develop epilepsy because 1 in 100 risk of developing epilepsy at some point in your lifetime. So there's always going to be that 1% background. But the patient has certain factors which make it a little bit more likely. Mom has epilepsy. She had early age of onset. She's got generalized spike wave on her EEG, and she's got those twitching myoclonic seizures. So we say that her risk of having a kid with epilepsy is about 5%. So 5% still means that there's a greater than 90% chance that the kid is going to be seizure-free. So it's really low. But mom has another question, though. Okay, 5%, but if my kid gets epilepsy, is it going to be like mine? Mine is, well controlled right now on seizure medication. Is she going to have school problems or, learning problems or motor problems from the epilepsy? So basically what she's asking is if her kid gets epilepsy, is it going to be like hers, or is it going to be something different? Is it going to be a different syndrome? So the question is, does epilepsy breed true? And that we go back to those twin studies, and the bottom line is, I'm not going to get through all this data. It does look like that. Benign generalized epilepsies do tend to, if they occur in offspring, it tends to be the same type. So They most often do. So the most heritable ones are the benign forms of epilepsy, the genetic forms, which usually respond to medications, or maybe epilepsies like the childhood absence epilepsy, which goes away after childhood often. So generally, genetic epilepsies tend to be the benign epilepsies and not severe catastrophic epilepsies, which lead to intellectual problems or learning problems. So, but there's always exceptions to the rule. You got to be really careful, not to miss like a simple form of simple inheritance or strong gene. Examples would be something like tuberous sclerosis, which is a condition which causes skin abnormalities, brain tumors, and seizures. And that may be mild in one family member, but really severe in another. Fortunately, that's very, very rare, and we could do genetic testing for that. So, well, let's just go back. What's the role of genetic testing? And this is still being really shaped, and I don't think there's a lot of really even good guidelines for conditions about when and who should be tested. It's, like I said, it's usually more complex inheritance, and there's no genetic test for those piranhas. So you may just end up with a negative test or a confusing test, because you get some results back and it's really hard to know what it means. Genetic tests are very expensive and they may not be covered by insurance. So you must have a really good reason before you want to do it. So, some patients have epilepsy associated with other developmental delays or other features, and they may benefit from genetic tests. And there's some simple, cheap ones that you can do, like looking at those chromosomes, seeing if there's too many chromosomes, or metabolic tests, which are blood tests to see how the genes are functioning. MRI and other clinical tests may be really useful and things to do before you go do your genetic testing. I'm not going to say that it's never important. I just saw a patient this week who I recommended that she have gene testing. Sometimes genetic testing is important to, help us decide what's going to be the best treatment for a patient and what drugs to avoid. It can help us determine a patient's long-term prognosis and also family planning. So, and there's more benefits that we can see as well. Help us confirm a specific diagnosis like Dravet syndrome. Could, besides helping us give a diagnosis, it can tell us if this epilepsy is going to be associated with other neurological or medical conditions like heart conditions or kidney conditions, which may be really important to recognize and get to the right specialist and treat them. Also, the genetic testing may be helpful for preventing unnecessary or invasive testing. It's Dravet syndrome, that's in all the genes of the brain, so that's not something you're going to want to do like invasive brain surgery on. All right, so the future is pharmacogenetics. Besides making the diagnosis, how can genes help us, with our therapy? So really, unfortunately in today's day and age, choosing anti-seizure medications is really still just a process of trial and error. We get some good guesses based on the epilepsy syndrome and the seizure types to determine what kind of drug we want to use. But we have many drugs, so we're not sure which one. And then dose, we just have some guidelines from our clinical trials, but this is not pools of patients that we're looking at. We're looking at individuals. So we're really talking about tailored medicine. This is individualized medicine we're looking at. So in new onset epilepsy, 40 to 50% won't respond to the first seizure medication we can use. So it'd be great if we had some tests that we can use to predict that and also to predict what dose we can use. and also to avoid side effects. So how does pharmacogenetics work in theory? Well, genes influence how well each seizure medication binds to their target in the brain. Remember, we talked about those ion channels. You know, are they going for the right leaky spot on the ion channel? And they also affect, there's genes in the liver, separate genes, which influence how much seizure medication reaches the brain. So if the liver enzymes are very strong, then the seizure medication is going to be too low, and you're going to have seizures. Too much, and or some toxic byproduct, you're going to get side effects. So we don't really have any really good tests yet for pharmacogenetics, but I think many centers are working on that. I think one exception would be for carbamazepine and related drugs. There is something called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, or TEN, which is a very severe skin reaction that can be very, very damaging. And it's been shown that there's very important genetic risk for that. There's something called the HLA slash B1502 allele, which influences a person's risk to get this severe skin reaction if they're started on carbamazepine or one of these related drugs. And studies have shown that that type of gene, or what we call allele, is more common in patients who are from Asia, Southeast Asia, and Han Chinese also. So this is something that we're really careful with, and the FDA actually recommends that before you start this medication on anybody with the Asian ancestry, they recommend doing some genetic testing, which is very simple, to look for this allele to try to prevent this very severe reaction. So again, to conclude, I'm going to try to give you a good overview of the field, and I think that advances in epilepsy genetics will alter how we treat patients. We're trying to identify genes involved in epilepsy that will allow us to make more precise diagnosis, counsel our patients, and really hopefully select therapy in a more appropriate way for our patients. So much more research needs to be done. I think if you know someone who has many family members affected with epilepsy, contact your epileptologist and consider joining a research study. This is going to be really the way to pave our way forward in with epilepsy. So thank you very, very much, and I will take any questions, I guess, now.